Hi guys, this is your video lecture for December 8th. We're going to be covering pages 160 to 165 of your chapter 14 in your family living book about appetizers and desserts. Okay, so we're going to start talking about cakes. Cakes are one of the most versatile desserts. You can use it for any occasion. You can use it for birthdays, you can use it for holidays, you can use it as an afternoon snack, as well as for a dessert. And we of course know that cakes are one of the most loved dessert, and some of the most interesting cooking shows are all about baking cakes and desserts of that nature. But did you know there are two main categories of cakes? There are shortened, or they're also called butter cakes, versus unshortened cakes. And so there's a difference between the two. So what is the difference? Well, the difference is the type of leavening used. So for instance, butter cakes use baking powder or baking soda as a leavening agent. Foam cakes, on the other hand, which are unshortened cakes, use their volume, they get their volume from beaten egg whites. And some foam cakes also use chemical leavening agent. But both types are delicious and both types are equally fun to prepare. So let's start talking about butter cakes. Remember, butter cakes are also known as shortened cakes. And there are certain characteristics that we know that characterize butter cakes. So usually they have high rounded, smooth tops. They have an even inside texture with no tunnels. They are usually light, moist, and velvety. And they have some key ingredients. They have fat, flour, leavening, liquid, salt, and sugar. So when I say fat, that is the form of shortening that is used in the butter cakes or the shortened cakes. And this could be butter, margarine, or oil, and this gives the cake its tenderness. Flour, of course, forms the framework or structure of the cake. And then there's the leavening, which I mentioned earlier with shortened cakes is either baking powder or baking soda, or it could be both. And it's used to give rise and lightness to the cake. And then we have a liquid that's used to make the cake, and this can be water, milk, or even fruit juice. It just depends on the type of cake. And the liquid helps in gluten development that aids in mixing the ingredients together. We also would add a little salt to add some flavor to the cake, and then sugar, which adds flavor and it helps to tenderize the cake. Okay, so those are the ingredients, but what about the pan? Well, the best kind of pan to use is a shiny pan. This is going to give you the best results. But if you use a different kind of pan, like a dark colored pan, or if you use a glass pan, it's important that you decrease the temperature in the oven by 25 degrees. Otherwise, your cake's not going to come out as well because of the fact that the dark colored pan and the glass are going to attract more heat, and so the cooking time is going to be off, and then your cake might get too done. So if you decrease the temperature in the oven by 25 degrees, and you would, of course, base this upon what was called for in the recipe, then you can adjust for the different types of pans. But the best kind to use is a shiny pan. You also want to make sure that you use the correct size, because if the pan is too large, the cake will be flat and dry, and if the pan is too small, the cake will not bake evenly. It will become overbaked on the outside, and the interior will remain underbaked. So it's very important that you use the correct size of pan. Okay, so what about making the batter? Well, it's very important that you mix the cake following the recipe instructions exactly, because you can have problems with overmixing or undermixing if you don't. If you overmix, then the cake will develop tunnels and it will get a tough texture. And if you undermix, then the cake will have a low volume. So you want to have the perfect mixture speed. If you use an electric mixer, you would just follow the instructions. But if you don't have an electric mixer, like I don't have an electric mixer, I mix cake batter by hand. You would want to stir 150 strokes for each minute of recommended beating time. And again, this has to do with what the instructions say. Sometimes instructions don't give a beating time. Sometimes it just says stir until smooth or something like that. For the best results, you want to fill your pan halfway with the batter. Okay, so let's talk about some baking techniques that are going to make your cake awesome. You always want to bake as close to the center of the oven as possible. This helps to give the cake the most even temperature when it's baking, so all the cake is done at the same time. You want to evenly space pans between themselves and the oven walls, so if you're putting multiple pans in there at a time, you want to make sure that there's an inch of space between them and the oven walls. So if you had 2 pans in there, you'd want to make sure there's at least an inch between the 2 pans and then an inch between the oven wall and the pans. You definitely want to place the pans in the same rack. If you don't, then there's going to be different baking times. One will get done before the other, and if you don't check on it, it can cause problems. If you have extra pans filled with batter that need to be cooked, you want to definitely refrigerate those, because remember, a lot of times baking batter has perishable ingredients in it, and you want to make sure that you're not letting it sit out too long. To test for doneness, there's 2 tests that you can do. One is to insert a toothpick, or you can use a fork, in the middle of the cake, and if it comes out clean, then the cake is done. Another test is the touch test. And so basically, with the touch test, all you have to do is to gently touch the center of the cake. And if the cake is done, it will respond to you in a certain way. A done cake will feel set and will bounce back. You want to make sure that you let the cake rest and cool for 10 minutes. I don't know why I said cook. I'm sorry. That should say cool. Let the cake cool for 10 minutes before removing from the pan. And so there's going to be certain protocol that you're going to follow when you are removing a cake from a pan. You're going to slide a knife or a metal spatula around the edges of the cake, invert the cooling rack onto the cake pan, and flip both over simultaneously. And then you're going to allow the cake to drop out of the pan and onto the rack. And then you, of course, want to make sure that the cake cools a little bit longer in a draft-free area. All right, let's keep going. How do you store cake? Well, there's different ways to store cake. It depends on the type of cake. And this, of course, is after the cake is completely cooled. So, for example, if you are keeping a cake that's not frosted, you can keep it in an airtight container, a cake saver, or it should be covered tightly with plastic wrap or foil. This is going to help the cake's freshness be preserved. If you have used creamy frosting on your cake, you want to make sure that you loosely cover the frosted cake with wax paper or foil and place it in a cake safe. Again, you want to maintain the cake's freshness by putting it up. If you're using fluffy frosting, plan to serve the cake the same day that it's frosted. And that's because fluffy frosting is cooked frosting containing egg whites, and so it won't have a really long shelf life. So you want to get that cake eaten as quickly as possible. You refrigerate cakes that contain very moist ingredients such as carrot cake and applesauce cakes. And that's because of the high moisture within these cakes. It can be more likely to develop mold if it's stored at room temperature, and that's something you definitely want to avoid. You don't want to serve your guests a cake with mold inside of it. And then, of course, you want to refrigerate cakes with frosting that contains ingredients that are typically refrigerated. So that would include cream cheese or whipped cream or anything like that. So if that's in the frosting you use, you definitely need to store that type of cake in the refrigerator. All right, let's talk about foam cakes, the other kind of cake. These are also called unshortened cakes. So these cakes depend on beaten egg whites to give them volume and lightness, and each type of foam cake has distinct characteristics. So examples of foam cake are going to include angel cake, chiffon cake, sponge cake, and they all have their own unique characteristics. For example, angel food cake contains a high ratio of beaten egg whites to flour sugar mixture, and it contains no fat, leavening, or egg yolks, and it has a very feather-like texture, and you cook it in a tube pan, and this is going to be different from a sponge cake or a chiffon cake, for example, because chiffon cakes contain fat and leavening and egg yolk, and so there's going to be a difference when you're comparing it to angel food cake, but it's still, they're both kinds of foam cake. Okay, so when you are making a foam cake, a lot of times you're going to use something called a it's called a a tube pan, and you can see that the tube right there is sticking up. And you're only going to grease the pan if the recipe calls for it. Otherwise, the cake actually needs to be able to cling to the sides of the pan as it rises. Okay, so how do you make the batter for angel food cake or sponge cake or chiffon cake or any type of foam cake? Well, what you're going to do is you're going to have egg whites that need to be beaten properly. That's the key to a successful foam cake. After they are beaten properly, you're going to take the sugar and flour mixture and you're going to fold it into the egg whites. Now you always want to fold the flour and sugar mixture into the egg whites rather than the egg whites into the flour/sugar mixture. So what do I mean by fold? Fold means to take the spatula down through the center of the mixture, drag it to the back of the bowl, and bring it up and over in a folding motion. Then you're going to turn the bowl a quarter turn, sprinkle on more of the flour mixture, and repeat the folding until all the flour and sugar mixture is incorporated. And it's also a good idea to drag a knife or metal spatula through the batter once it has been placed in the baking pan, because this will break down any large air pockets. Okay, so let's talk about some baking techniques. You're really basically going to bake, cool, and remove the foam cake from the pan the exact same way as the butter cake, but it's important to recognize that tube pans actually have to be handled a little bit differently. And remember, a tube pan, you could tell it's a tube pan because there's actually like a tube in the middle of the pan. And you're going to remove cake from a tube pan a little bit differently. So how you're going to do that is you're going to, of course, wait until the cake is cool, and then you're going to gently run a knife or metal spatula around the edges of the pan and turn it upside down. Tap the pan and the cake should come out. Most tube pans are designed with a removable bottom. If the cake does not fall out when tapped, the bottom of the pan should easily push out from the rest of the pan. Once the bottom is removed, run the knife or spatula between the bottom of the pan and the cake it should come out of the pan. Foam cakes will remain moist overnight if stored in the pan and loosely covered. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about, after checking for doneness, we have checking for doneness and then frosting. But after, let me talk briefly about checking for doneness. So you're going to check for doneness by feel and appearance. So if an angel food cake, for example, is done, you need to check the cracks in the top of the cake, that they should be dry, and the cake should spring back when lightly touched. Okay, so let's talk about the best part of cakes, which of course is the frosting. Frosting pretty much is the same across the board as far as ingredients. They're made from fat, flavoring liquid, and sugar. Remember, fat is margarine or butter or something like that. And frosting has to have a certain consistency. It should be thin enough to spread, but thick enough to adhere to the cake. If it's too thin, you can add confection or sugar. If it's too thick, it can end up tearing the cake, which isn't good. And all you need to do is add some water or milk or something like that, a teaspoon at a time to help thin it. Also, you can put glaze on cakes. Glaze is a little bit different from frosting. It has a lower fat content and a higher percentage of liquid than frosting. If you need some tips for frosting, look on page 164 to 165. And then you need to do the section review on page 165.